I now want to remind you of an important theme from our lectures on gross domestic product. This is the sense in which there is an equivalency between investment and saving. And you'll recall that when we looked at the national income accounting identity, we saw that there was this relationship between investment and saving. Now, there we looked at what's called an open economy, and we saw that the relationship between investment and saving is fundamentally tied up with the relationship between imports and exports. I'm going to simplify things here and assume that either imports equals exports, so we have balanced trade, or that this is what is called a closed economy, an economy that does no trade. Now, neither of those two assumptions are needed for the Solow-Swan model, but again, having those assumptions in place will greatly simplify the analysis. I'll ask you in one of the exercises to use the national income accounting identity under the circumstances I've described and demonstrate for yourself that in either a balanced trade situation or a closed economy, it must be the case that the nation's saving is equivalent to the nation's investment. But I'd like you to think about this at a much more intuitive level and to ask the following question: where does the economy obtain the resources it needs for its investment? Now remember, investment are resources that are used now to procure a benefit in the future. Where do those resources come from? They must be resources that are withheld from current use. They must come from saving. They can't come from anywhere else. So in this Solow-Swan framework, when I speak about investment, a very important consideration is where does the economy find the resources for that investment? The answer must be from saving, because saving represents the resources in the economy that are not immediately consumed, that are not used to meet immediate needs. Those resources are therefore available for investment. In practice, how this happens is that savings flow into the financial system and are then lent out to businesses who use those savings to finance their investment. So whilst I don't want to have a formal model of the financial system in this framework, again, that is possible, think about that there is an institutional structure out there, a financial system, if you like, that ensures that the resources that are made available through the act of saving flow to firms who then have access to those resources to use for their investment purposes. So the key point here is investment draws on the resources that are made available through saving. Which means in the Solow-Swan framework, we need to think a bit about saving and how those resources actually are made available for investment. And we're going to use a very simple hypothesis about saving. The hypothesis about saving is that the saving per capita that takes place in the economy is some constant proportion of per capita income. And I've written it mathematically in this expression here. An example might be to have a value of theta, so that's the Greek letter theta, and we're going to call that the economy's saving rate, the proportion of per capita income that is saved. That might be a number like 0.4. What this is saying is that in this particular instance, 40% of the nation's per capita income is withheld from current use and used as saving. Now remember, the production function, which we've seen before, can be thought of as showing not just production, but also income. What I've done in this slide is to put a second line on this diagram that relates to saving. So this red line here is equal to 40% of per capita income. So how do you read a diagram like this? What's actually going on? Suppose the economy had a capital labour ratio equivalent to that point. Then that capital labour ratio will produce, or allow the economy to produce, is perhaps a better way to think about it, per capita income of 2.5. 40% of that per capita income is going to be saved, and we can read that from this red savings function, as it's often called. So we start with the capital labour ratio. That tells us how much income will be generated in this economy. And given our very simple view that saving is some proportion of income, that tells us how much saving will be generated in this economy. Remember, saving frees up resources. Saving frees up resources that can then be used for investment. So let me summarise what we've done so far. We've actually done, again, an enormous amount, and we're about 3/4 of the way, in fact, through the Solow-Swan model. Because what we've got here is a representation, simple representation, of saving and investment in the economy. And then we have a view of investment, and it can be either replacement investment or net investment, that tells us something about the circumstances in which the capital labour ratio can grow. Growth in the capital labour ratio, remember, is one path towards economic growth. So it's all summarised in these two forbidding equations, but really this is not really complicated mathematics. This is just shorthand notation where we've conveyed a great deal of information. So what information do we have here? On the left-hand side, total gross investment. Total gross investment can be divided across the two forms of investment: the replacement investment that stops the capital labour ratio from falling, and the net investment that actually leads to change in the capital labour ratio. We have a link between investment and saving, with saving freeing up the resources that are used for investment. And here we have a little hypothesis about how many resources in fact will be freed up through saving. Those resources will be some constant proportion, some constant fraction of per capita income. So there's a lot going on in that expression, but what I've done here is just pull together the discussion from the previous few slides to give us a pretty comprehensive picture of how the Solow-Swan model treats investment and saving. Now I want to focus on investment. Have a look at this expression here, which simply takes the information from the previous expression and rearranges it in the following way. What we learned from the previous expression is this: the amount of net investment, the investment that enables the capital labour ratio to change, is going to be equal to the amount of saving generated in the economy minus replacement investment. The way to think about this is saving frees up resources. It's resources that are not immediately used. Some of those resources are going to be devoted to the replacement investment that's needed to offset depreciation and population growth. If there are any resources left over, those resources can be used for net investment, and it is the net investment that enables the capital-labour ratio to change. So to summarise, for the per capita capital stock per person, the capital-labour ratio in other words, for that to change, there has to be some resources left over from per capita saving after what is needed for per capita replacement investment has been deducted or has been used. This is a key slide. It's very important that you understand what's going on in this slide. It's summarising an enormous amount of information, but it is information that's going to be absolutely key to understanding this Solow-Swan approach to economic growth.